My brother sold me Grandpa's trash for $100 and wrote, "No returns is a joke. Biggest mistake of his life." I was 12 years old when my grandfather taught me how to see. Not just look, see. We were standing in his darkroom, this tiny converted bathroom in the basement of his house outside Philadelphia. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, that sharp acidic bite of developer mixed with the sweet metallic tang of fixer. Red light bathed everything in this eerie glow, like being inside a beating heart. Grandpa Arthur had his sleeves rolled up, his forearms thick and scarred, hands that looked like they'd been through a war. Because they had. He was showing me how to develop film. Real film, not the digital garbage everyone was switching to even back then. He held a strip of negatives up to the light, squinting through these thick glasses he always wore, and I remember thinking his hands looked ancient, veiny, spotted, but steady, rock steady. He told me something that day I've never forgotten. He said a camera is just a box. Nothing magical about it. It's your heart that does the shooting, your eye that finds the light. He'd tap his chest when he said it, right over where I guess his heart was supposed to be, though I sometimes wondered if all those years in Vietnam had calcified something in there. Grandpa Arthur was Army Signal Corps. Vietnam, 1967 to 1969. Before that, Korea. He'd seen things that hollowed men out from the inside, but somehow he came back with this ability to find beauty in the wreckage. His photographs were incredible. Not the posed family portrait stuff. Real documentary work. Faces of soldiers. Children in bombed villages. The geometry of destroyed buildings. I'd spend hours looking through his portfolios, trying to understand how he could make suffering look so heartbreakingly human. That day in the darkroom, after we finished developing the role, he took me upstairs to his office. This was his sanctuary. Nobody else was allowed in there. Not my mom, not my grandmother when she was still alive. Nobody, just me. He opened this old wooden cabinet, the kind with brass hinges that squeaked, and inside was his collection. Cameras, lenses, equipment I couldn't even name. There was a Hasselblad, a couple of Nikons from the 70s, and on the top shelf, wrapped in felt cloth like holy relics, were the Leicas. He unwrapped one carefully, cradling it like a newborn, and let me hold it. The weight surprised me. It was dense, serious, purposeful. He told me these cameras were worth more than most people's cars. Some of them were older than he was. Then he said something that would haunt me for the next 11 years. He said when he was gone, all of this would be mine. Every camera, every lens, every piece of history in that cabinet. He looked right at me with those pale blue eyes that photographed the worst humanity had to offer, and said I understood light in a way his daughter never would. My mother saw the world in price tags and property values. I saw what mattered. I believed him. Kids always believe their grandparents. Grandpa Arthur died on a Tuesday. Stroke. Massive. He was 78 years old and gone before the ambulance made it to his driveway. I got the call at work. I was 23 by then, driving a delivery van for a medical supply company, barely scraping together rent on a studio apartment in a neighborhood where you learn to sleep through gunshots. My phone buzzed during a drop-off at a nursing home, and it was my mom's name on the screen, which was unusual because we didn't talk much. Her voice was flat when she told me. Not sad, just informative. Your grandfather passed away this morning. Funeral arrangements to follow. She hung up before I could respond. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, engine running, trying to process that the man who taught me to see was just gone. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. The funeral was small. Grandpa Arthur wasn't a social man. A few other veterans showed up, old guys with worn faces and VFW hats. They stood stiff and silent during the service, and I wondered what memories were playing behind their eyes. I tried to give a eulogy, but my throat closed up after 2 sentences. I couldn't do it. My mother looked annoyed. My stepfather checked his phone. My brother Kyle didn't even pretend to care. He spent the whole service texting. After the burial, my mother informed me she'd be handling the estate. Grandpa Arthur never updated his will after my grandmother died. Under intestacy laws in Pennsylvania, Everything automatically went to his next of kin, his only child, my mother, Linda. I asked about his promise, about the cameras, about what he told me when I was 12 years old. She gave me this look. Not mean, just practical, cold practicality. She said there was nothing in writing. She said maintaining her house cost money. Property taxes weren't cheap. My brother's BMW lease wasn't going to pay itself. Did I want them to lose their home? Everything had to be sold. All of it. I should have fought harder. I should have screamed. But I was 23 and broke and exhausted, and she was my mother, and some part of me still wanted her approval, even though I knew I'd never get it. The estate liquidator showed up 3 days later. This guy wasn't some Sotheby's expert with white gloves and an Oxford education. He was a bulk liquidator, the kind who handles estate sales for people who just want everything gone fast. He walked through Grandpa's house with a clipboard and a calculator, slapping price stickers on furniture, glassware, books. He moved like he was on a timer, which he probably was. Time is money in his line of work. My mother and stepfather followed him around like vultures, writing down numbers, already spending money in their heads. I watched them inventory my grandfather's life like they were doing a grocery run. The Hasselblad, auction. The Nikons, auction. The best lenses, the military medals, the framed photographs from Vietnam, all tagged for professional sale. I tried to speak up. I really did. I asked if I could at least have one of the cameras. Something to remember him by. Something that meant something. My mother said no before I even finished the sentence. She said sentiment doesn't pay bills, Leo. She said I needed to grow up and understand how the real world works. My stepfather nodded along like a bobblehead. He's the kind of man who married money and calls it success. Soft hands, softer spine. He spent the whole time calculating their cut on his phone. They decided to do a yard sale for everything the liquidator deemed not valuable enough for auction. The leftovers, the junk. A sunny Saturday in October, the kind of crisp fall day that makes suburbia look like a postcard. My mother's neighborhood is the kind where everyone has 2-car garages and professionally landscaped lawns and memberships to the country club they can't actually afford. I showed up early. I don't know why. Morbid curiosity, maybe. Or some desperate hope I could salvage something. Anything. The entire front lawn was covered with tables. Grandpa's possessions spread out like organs and autopsy. Dishes he ate off of for 50 years. Books he read. Clothes he wore. Strangers picking through his life, haggling over prices, carrying away pieces of him in plastic grocery bags. Kyle was sitting in a folding chair near the driveway, playing games on his phone, occasionally collecting money. He had the smug look on his face. 25 years old and still living at home, driving a BMW he can't afford, working some vague marketing job that I'm pretty sure is actually him posting on Instagram. He's the golden child. Always has been. Athletic build. Easy smile. Everything came easy to Kyle. Nothing came easy to me. I walked around the tables, trying not to let anyone see how much this gutted me. Strangers were buying Grandpa's coffee mugs for 50 cents. His reading glasses for $2. A woman in yoga pants and designer sunglasses was haggling over a lamp that used to sit on his desk, where he'd review contact sheets late into the night. Everything had a price. Nothing had value. Then I saw the box. It was sitting by itself near the garage, away from the tables, like it wasn't even worth the effort displaying properly. Cardboard, bent corners. Someone had written on it in black marker, parts/scrap. I opened it. Inside was exactly what you'd expect from a box labeled scrap. Broken camera flashes with cracked bulbs, tangled cables, rusted screws and bolts, the detritus of a lifetime spent fixing equipment in the field. And buried in the middle of it all, wrapped in an old shop rag, was a black object, a camera. It looked like absolute trash. I'm not being dramatic. The black paint was flaking off in patches, showing bare metal underneath. The viewfinder had yellow tape wrapped around it, the kind that gets sticky and gross with age. There was no lens attached, just an empty mount staring back at me like a socket without an eye. Dust and grime coated every surface. It looked like something you'd find in a dumpster behind a pawn shop. The estate liquidator had walked right past it, probably glanced at it, and wrote it off as broken hobby junk, not worth the paperwork. But underneath the crud and tape and flaking paint, I recognized the shape, the weight, the brass construction under all that cosmetic damage. This was quality, once. Or at least I thought it was. Could have been a Soviet knockoff. Could have been worthless. Under the camera was an envelope. I opened it with shaking hands. Photographs. Black and white prints. The corners bent and yellowed. Grandpa's war photography. Soldiers in foxholes. Faces streaked with mud. A medic working on a wounded man. A child standing in front of a destroyed building, holding a doll. These weren't published photos. These were personal, private, the images he couldn't sell or wouldn't show anyone. I felt something crack open in my chest. These were the last pieces of him that mattered, the last evidence that Arthur Bennett saw the world differently than everyone else, that he turned horror into art, into memory, into something that meant something. And they were sitting in a trash box, by a garage, at a yard sale, price to move. I carried the box over Kyle. My hands were shaking. I was trying to hold it together, but I could feel rage and grief fighting for control behind my ribs. I asked him how much for the box. Kyle didn't even look up from his phone. He made this dismissive gesture, like I was bothering him. He said there might be $50 worth of metal in there if I scrapped it properly. But since I was family, he'd cut me a deal. $100, and it was mine. I stared at him. My brother. My own blood, selling me our grandfather's memories for $100 and acting like he was doing me a favor. I pulled out my phone, opened Venmo. My checking account had exactly $347 in it. That was supposed to last me until next Friday. Rent was due on the 1st. I had bills. I needed gas. I needed food, but I needed those photographs more. I sent him $100. Every muscle in my body felt tight. My jaw hurt from clenching it. Kyle's phone chimed. He looked at the notification and grinned. Then he did something I'll never forget as long as I live. He typed something into the Venmo transaction, added a note. I watched him do it, watched his thumbs move across the screen, watched him smirk at his own joke. The notification popped up on my phone. Payment completed. And underneath, scrap metal box, final sale, no returns. He thought it was hilarious. Writing no returns for a box of garbage. Making fun of me for buying trash. This was entertainment to him. His poor delivery driver brother scraping together money to buy worthless junk. Peak comedy. I grabbed the box, shoved it into my backpack. The weight of it dug into my shoulders. Kyle called after me, still laughing. He said something about how I always was sentimental, how I needed to learn when to let go of stuff. I walked away, didn't run, didn't look back, just walked down that perfect suburban driveway past a perfect lawn with the perfect stranger cars parked along the street. My mother was inside the house, showing someone the good china. She didn't see me leave. Nobody saw me leave. I walked 3 blocks to where I'd parked my beat-up Honda Civic and put the box in the passenger seat, like it was precious cargo, like it mattered. Maybe I was an idiot. Maybe Kyle was right, and I just spent money I couldn't afford on actual trash. Maybe I was being sentimental and stupid and weak, but those photographs were real. Grandpa's work was real. His promise was real, even if the law didn't care. And somewhere deep in my gut, underneath the anger and grief and humiliation, I had this tiny voice whispering that maybe, possibly, that destroyed camera wasn't as worthless as it looked. I drove home with the box sitting next to me. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield. My phone buzzed with a low balance warning from my bank app. I ignored it. In my rear-view mirror, my mother's neighborhood got smaller. Those perfect houses, those perfect lawns, that perfect life built on credit cards and appearances, and selling your father's legacy for parts. I thought about Grandpa Arthur in that darkroom, the way he handled negatives like they were made of light itself, the way he told me I understood things my mother never would. He was right about that part at least. She understood money, status, what things cost. I understood what things were worth. There's a difference. The box sat on my passenger seat the entire drive home, like a silent passenger judging my life choices. 20 minutes through Philadelphia traffic, past the nice neighborhoods with their pristine lawns, through the transitional areas where the houses got smaller and the bars on windows got thicker. Finally to my neighborhood, where you learn not to leave anything visible in your car, and the sound of police sirens was basically white noise. I carried the box up 3 flights of stairs to my studio apartment. The building smelled like curry and cigarettes, and something else I'd never quite identified but had learned to ignore. My door stuck like it always did. I had to hip check it to get it open. Home sweet home. 400 square feet of my life. A mattress on the floor, because I'd never gotten around to buying a bed frame. A desk I'd found on the curb. My clothes in plastic bins because the closet door was broken. And on every available wall surface, my own photographs. Prints I'd made over the years. Street photography mostly. Faces. Architecture. Light and shadow. Nothing great. Nothing anyone would pay money for. But they were mine. My Canon DSLR sat on the desk, a mid-range model I bought used 5 years ago. It was functional. Professional enough for the occasional freelance gig that helped supplement the delivery driving. But standing next to Grandpa's equipment, it always felt like a toy. I set the cardboard box on the shelf above my desk. Right there between my collection of vintage photography books and a dying, succulent plant my ex-girlfriend had left behind. The books were from library sales, dollar bins, anywhere I could find them cheap. Adams, Kappa, Cartier-Bresson, the Masters. I pulled out Grandpa's photographs first, handled them like they might disintegrate. Those black and white images of war and humanity and suffering transformed into art. I found an old frame, cleaned the glass, and mounted the best one. A soldier's face, young, maybe 19, covered in mud, eyes staring at something beyond the camera, beyond the photographer, beyond everything. That went on the wall, right above my desk where I could see it every day. The camera, though, that ugly, broken, disgusting camera. I pulled it out and set it on the desk next to my Canon. The contrast was almost offensive. My camera was sleek, modern, plastic and rubber and clean lines. This thing looked like something you'd find in a flooded basement. The black paint was flaking off like a bad case of psoriasis. That yellowed tape around the viewfinder was probably older than I was. No lens, just that empty mount staring back like a socket without an eyeball. It looked pathetic next to my gear, like bringing your drunk uncle to a wedding. I should have put it away, should have stored it in the box, kept the photographs, forgotten about the rest. But something kept me looking at it. Maybe it was the weight, when I picked it up, heavier than it should be for its size, denser, like the metal underneath all that cosmetic damage was serious. Or maybe I just wanted to believe Grandpa had left me something worth keeping. I left it sitting there and went to make dinner. Ramen, the fancy kind that cost $1.50 instead of 50 cents. Living large. My cat, Hendrix, had other plans. Hendrix is this orange tabby I found in an alley 2 years ago, half-starved and missing part of his ear. I'd taken him to the vet, spent money I didn't have, and now he repaid me by knocking things off surfaces and judging my life choices. We had an understanding. I fed him. He tolerated my existence. I was in the kitchen area, which was really just a corner of the room with a hot plate and a mini fridge, when I heard the crash, that specific sound of something hitting hardwood. Not the light plastic sound of modern electronics. Something heavy, something metal, something expensive possibly breaking into pieces. I spun around just in time to see Hendrix sitting on my desk, tail swishing, staring down at the floor where the camera had landed. He looked at me with that cat expression that somehow manages to convey both complete innocence and total premeditation. My heart was in my throat as I picked it up. The back had popped open on impact. That's how old and loose the mechanisms were. I was terrified I'd see cracked brass or broken pieces, that I just watched the last tangible piece of my grandfather shatter on my apartment floor because of a cat with no concept of sentimental value. But it looked okay. The same amount of beat up it had been before. The back panel had just come loose, that was all. I held it under my desk lamp to examine it closer. And that's when I started noticing things I'd missed before. The flaking paint was hiding something. Under those patches where the black had completely worn away, I could see brass. Not cheap hot metal. Not aluminum. Brass. Heavy, serious. Built to last a century brass. This thing was constructed like a tank. No wonder it was so heavy. The viewfinder wasn't just any viewfinder. It was this weird tubular thing, completely different from what you'd see on modern cameras. Primitive looking, but precisely machined. I could see the craftsmanship even under the grime and tape, and the body shape itself. Compact, boxy, utilitarian. It looked ancient, but intentionally ancient, like it had been designed by someone who cared more about function than form, in an era when cameras were still figuring out what they wanted to be. I started wiping away some of the dust with a paper towel, gently, like I was doing archaeology, and I found markings. On the front, where you'd expect to see a brand name, there was nothing, just smooth metal where the paint had flaked away. But on the side, so small I almost missed it, there was an engraving, barely visible. Someone had stamped into the metal, in letters maybe 2 millimeters tall, Germany. That was it, just Germany. No company name, no model number, just the country of origin, like that was supposed to mean something. And on the back panel, near the hinge, another marking. This one I could barely make out even with the lamp directly on it. Number 125. A serial number. My first thought was Soviet copy. I'd seen those before in photography forums. The USSR had basically stolen the Leica design in the 30s and 40s and cranked out thousands of knockoff cameras. Fed, Zorky. They copied everything, right down to the shape, and sold them for a fraction of cost. They were collector's items now, but cheap collector's items. The kind that sell for $50 at flea markets. Maybe $200 if they're in pristine condition with original packaging. That made sense. Grandpa had been in occupied Germany after the war. Probably picked this up at some bombed-out market in Berlin for a couple of cigarettes and a Hershey bar. Brought it home thinking it might be useful. Realized it was junk. Threw it in a box. Mystery solved. I had a broken Soviet knockoff camera, worth maybe the price of a decent lunch. I was about to put it back on the shelf when something nagged at me. Soviet copies usually had markings. Fed was stamped right on the front. Zorky, too. They were proud of their cameras, even if they'd stolen the design. And the ones I'd seen photos of online, they didn't look quite like this. The proportions were slightly off. The viewfinder was different. The texture of the metal wasn't the same. So I did what any person in the 21st century does when they need answers. I Googled it. Started broad. Vintage black camera Germany. Got about 1 million results, none of them helpful. Old Kodaks, ancient box cameras. Nothing that looked like this. I tried tubular viewfinder vintage camera. Better. Started getting results about rangefinders, about pre-war German cameras, about the evolution of portable photography in the 1920s and 30s. I fell down a rabbit hole. One forum post led to another. Rangefinderforum.com became my entire evening. These people were obsessive. They could identify cameras by a single screw placement. They knew the history of every manufacturer that had ever existed. They spoke in technical terms I barely understood, but tried to follow. Bayonet mounts, focal plane shutters, coupled rangefinders. And then I found a post from maybe 6 years ago. Someone asking about an old camera they'd inherited. No branding on the front. Minimalist engraving. Some of the responses were typical forum snark. But one person wrote something that made my stomach drop. They said if there's no manufacturer name on the front, check the serial number. Pre-1925 prototypes had minimalist engraving because they were made before marketing departments existed, before mass production, when cameras were still being hand-assembled by craftsmen who cared more about function than logos. Pre-1925, I looked at the camera sitting on my desk, at that tiny engraving, number 125. My hands were shaking a little as I typed a new search. Like a serial number 125, the results loaded. I clicked on the first link. It was an archived database of Leica serial numbers, maintained by some German photography museum. A comprehensive list of every Leica ever made, organized by production year and model. I scrolled down, past the modern models, past the M series from the 50s and 60s, further back, to the very beginning, to a section labeled Leica Zero Series. No Serie in German. Zero Series. The description made my vision tunnel. The Leica Zero Series were prototype cameras manufactured in 1923, before the company officially launched the Leica I in 1925. These were test units, experimental models. Ernst Laetz had his team build approximately 25 cameras to field test the concept of a portable 35mm camera. They were numbered from roughly 100 to 130. They were sent to photographers, journalists, anyone who might provide feedback on the design. Most were returned. Some were destroyed. A few disappeared into private collections. And they were considered the holy grail of camera collecting. I had to stand up, had to walk to the window, had to remind myself to breathe. The streetlights were coming on outside. Somewhere down the block, someone was shouting. A car alarm was going off. Normal night, sounds in my neighborhood. But inside my apartment, time had stopped. I went back to the computer, typed Leica Zero Series auction. Needed to know if this was real. Needed to know what I was looking at. The first result was from 2018, Laet's Photographica auction in Vienna. Leica Zero Series number 122 sold for 2,970,000 euros. I did the currency conversion. About 3.4 million US dollars at that exchange rate. $3 million for a camera. But it got worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. I found another article from 2022, a Leica Zero Series, serial number 107, sold at a Hong Kong auction for $14.4 million. $14.4 million, a world record for any camera ever sold. The article included photographs of the camera. I compared them to the things sitting on my desk, the shape of the body, the position of the viewfinder, the type of metal, the bayonet mount design, the placement of tiny screws that most people would never notice. Everything matched. Everything. I picked up the camera again. This time my hands were definitely shaking. I was afraid to grip it too hard. Afraid I'd scratch something, damage something, destroy $14 million with sweaty fingerprints. But I had to be sure. Had to verify this wasn't just wishful thinking. Wasn't just a desperate kid trying to find value in garbage because he couldn't face the reality that his mother had sold his grandfather's legacy for parts. I found technical drawings, museum archives from Germany, detailed blueprints of the Leica Zero Series design. I compared them to my camera, the thickness of the brass top plate, the diameter of the lens mount, the angle of the viewfinder tube, the position of the shutter speed dial. Every single detail matched. I thought about Grandpa, about how he'd thrown this in a box marked parts/scrap, about how he'd wrapped it in an old rag and forgotten it existed. And I realized he genuinely didn't know what he had. The research explained why. These prototypes were famously unreliable. The shutters jammed. The film advanced incorrectly. The seals leaked light. They were revolutionary in concept but flawed in execution. That's why Laetz spent 2 more years refining the design before launching the Leica I. For a working professional photographer like Grandpa, this would have been useless. Worse than useless. Actively frustrating. He'd probably bought it cheap in occupied Berlin in the late 40s or early 50s, thinking he'd scored a deal on a Leica, tried to use it, realized it didn't work, threw it in a box and forgot about it. He had no idea he was storing a museum piece. A historical artifact, the beginning of portable photography as we know it. I tested the shutter, pressed the release button gently. It made this sound. Rough, mechanical, imperfect. Nothing like the smooth action of a modern camera. It sounded broken. It sounded old. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing a professional photographer would abandon as unusable. But collectors didn't care if it worked. They cared that it existed. They cared that it was real. They cared that they could own a piece of the moment when photography changed forever. And I owned serial number 125. Bought it for $100 from my brother, who thought he was ripping me off. Bought it in a transaction he'd marked final sale, no returns, because he thought it was funny. I sat at my desk until 3 in the morning, reading everything I could find, learning about Ernst Laetz, about Oscar Barnack, who designed the original camera, about the history of 35mm photography, about why these prototypes mattered. The Leica Zero series wasn't just expensive because it was rare. It was expensive because it represented an idea. The idea that photography could be portable, personal, immediate. Before Leica, cameras were huge, required tripods, needed careful setup. Photography was formal, posed, controlled. Barnack changed that. He created a camera you could carry in your pocket, could shoot in the moment, could capture life as it happened. And these prototypes were the proof of concept. The moment before the revolution. Hendricks jumped back on the desk, sniffed the camera, lost interest, started cleaning himself. I envied him. His biggest concern was whether his food bowl was full and if that spot of sunlight would return tomorrow. He had no concept that he just knocked a $14 million object onto the floor. I carefully placed the camera back on the shelf, this time in the center, away from the edge, away from the cat, away from anything that could damage it. My hands were still shaking. I felt nauseous, excited, terrified, like I'd accidentally swallowed something radioactive and wasn't sure if it would kill me or give me superpowers. I thought about calling someone. But who? My mother who'd sold it to me for scrap? My brother who made a joke of the transaction? Friends who were struggling to pay rent just like me, who'd think I was insane or lying or both. No, this was mine. My secret, my discovery, my grandfather's final gift, even if he hadn't known he was giving it. The sun was starting to come up, gray light creeping through my window. I had a delivery shift in 4 hours. Needed sleep. Couldn't sleep. My brain was moving too fast. Because now I had a different problem. What the hell do you do when you discover you're holding $14 million in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a neighborhood where people got mugged for their phones? What do you do when you realize the thing you thought was worthless is actually priceless? What do you do when you're broke and desperate and holding a winning lottery ticket, but you don't know how to cash it in? I had no idea, but I knew I couldn't keep it here. Couldn't leave it on a shelf next to a dying plant where any random disaster could destroy it. Couldn't risk Hendricks deciding it would make a good toy at 3 in the morning. Couldn't trust that my apartment wouldn't get broken into or that the building wouldn't catch fire or that I wouldn't somehow lose the most valuable thing I'd ever touched. I needed help. Professional help. Expert help. I needed to figure out how a delivery driver with $347 in his bank account was supposed to handle owning a piece of history. The camera sat on the shelf, silent and small and deceptively ordinary looking. Just an old piece of metal and glass. Just a broken prototype someone threw away 90 years ago. Just the answer to every problem I'd ever had. If I didn't screw this up. The next morning I was still sitting at my desk, half convinced I'd hallucinated the entire night. But the camera was still there, still real, still worth more money than I could properly conceptualize. I tried to sleep, but my brain wouldn't shut down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw auction numbers climbing. Every time I started to drift off, panic would jolt me awake with thoughts of fires or break-ins or some cosmic joke that would take this away from me. At 7 I made a decision. I couldn't do this alone. Couldn't keep a $14 million secret in a studio apartment where the deadbolt barely worked. I needed professional help. Real help. The kind of help that deals with objects like this. I found the website for Laet's Photographica auction in Vienna. They were the ones who'd sold that other Zero Series camera for millions. If anyone could verify what I had, it was them. Writing that email was harder than anything I'd done in my life. How do you explain to strangers that you think you're holding a fortune? How do you not sound insane or like you're wasting their time? I must have written and deleted 20 versions before I finally hit send. The subject line was simple, possible Leica Zero series authentication request. In the body, I kept it factual. Found camera and family estate. Serial number 125. No lens. Shows age and wear. Matches historical descriptions of Zero series prototypes. Attached several high-resolution photos I'd taken with my Canon, using every photography skill Grandpa had taught me. Macro shots of the serial number, the Germany engraving, the viewfinder mechanism, the brass construction under the flaking paint. Then I waited. Checked my email every 5 minutes like a teenager waiting for a text back from their crush. The response came 4 hours later. Professional, cautious. They received authentication requests frequently, and most turned out to be copies or wishful thinking. But the serial number was interesting. The details in my photographs were promising. Could I send additional images? Specifically of the bayonet mount mechanism and the shutter curtain? I spent the rest of the day photographing that camera from every conceivable angle, used every lighting technique I knew, made sure every detail was visible and sharp. My hand shook the entire time, terrified I'd drop it or damage it or somehow decrease its value with my fingerprints. Sent a new batch of photos. Waited again. The second response came the next day. Different tone. Excited. Urgent. They needed to send someone to examine the camera in person. Would I be available for an expert to visit? They could arrange travel within 72 hours. I looked around my apartment, at the stained carpet and the mattress on the floor, and the general aesthetic of barely making rent. Then I looked at the camera, at $14 million, sitting on a shelf next to a dying succulent. I told them yes. Dr. Werner Schmidt arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I'd taken the day off work, told my supervisor I had a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. This was definitely an emergency, and it definitely involved family, just not in a way anyone would expect. The man who knocked on my door looked exactly like what you'd imagine a European camera historian would look like. 70-something, silver hair perfectly combed, wire-rimmed glasses, accent so thick it sounded like a movie character. He wore a 3-piece suit to my disaster of a neighborhood. I watched him navigate around a discarded mattress in the hallway without even acknowledging it existed. The contrast when he stepped into my apartment was almost funny. Here was this distinguished expert in a space where I'd eaten ramen for dinner 6 nights running, where my furniture was mostly salvaged from curbs, where the nicest thing I owned until 4 days ago was a 5-year-old camera. He set his leather briefcase on my desk with the careful precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. From inside, he pulled out white cotton gloves. Not latex, not nitrile. Pure white cotton conservator's gloves like you'd see in a museum. I handed him the camera. He took it with both hands, cradling it like it was made of glass. Then he sat at my desk, pulled out a jeweler's loupe, and proceeded to examine it in complete silence. 15 minutes. Maybe 20. He didn't say a word. Just turned it over slowly, studying every surface, every screw, every tiny detail. The only sound was traffic from the street below and Hendricks licking himself on the bed. I stood there sweating, convinced with every passing second that he was about to tell me it was a fake. A good fake maybe, but still worthless. That I'd built this entire fantasy in my head based on wishful thinking and desperation. Finally, he set the camera down gently on my desk, removed his gloves, looked at me over those wire-rimmed glasses. He said, with an accent that turned every word into 3 syllables, that this was a real thing. Original Leica Zero series, serial number 125. The camera had been presumed lost during the bombing of Dresden in 1945, destroyed along with thousands of other artifacts. But here it was, survived. Possibly because someone had taken it far away from Germany long before the bombs fell. He asked me where I got it. I told him the whole story. The yard sale, my grandfather, the $100, the Venmo transaction with my brother's joke about no returns. Dr. Schmidt actually smiled at that part. He said sometimes history has a sense of humor. We signed contracts that afternoon, right there at my desk where I'd been eating cup noodles the night before. The auction house would handle everything. Transportation, insurance, marketing, Authentication documentation. They estimated the camera would bring between 12 and 18 million at auction, possibly more if the right bidders showed up. Their commission was 15%. Still left me with enough money to never worry about rent again, or food, or anything really. I asked when they could take it. How soon could we move this forward before something went wrong? Before I woke up from this dream, Dr. Schmidt made some calls. Arrangements were made. The camera would need to be transported securely. They'd send a team. 2 days later, a plain white van pulled up outside my building. No markings. No indication of what was inside. 2 men in body armor got out. Brink security. They looked like they were preparing to transport nuclear codes, not a 90-year-old camera. They came upstairs with a specialized case. Climate-controlled. Foam interior cut to exact specifications. Sensors that would monitor temperature and humidity during transport. This thing had better security features than my apartment. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the hall opened her door just as they were leaving. She saw the body armor and the serious faces, and her eyes went wide. She asked me in Spanish-accented English if everything was okay, if I was in some kind of trouble, because that sure looked like the FBI to her. I told her I was just selling some old stuff. Nothing to worry about. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went back inside. I could practically hear her on the phone with her daughter before her door even closed. The camera left my possession in that case. I watched them carry it down 3 flights of stairs like it was a newborn baby. Watched them secure in the van. Watched them drive away with every cent of financial security I'd ever dreamed of. Then I went back inside and sat on my mattress and tried to process what had just happened. It didn't feel real. None of it felt real. The auction house posted about it 3 days later. A teaser on their Instagram account. Professionally photographed image of the camera on a white background. Someone's gloved hands holding it carefully. The caption talked about a lost treasure emerging from a private American collection. A piece of photographic history, presumed destroyed in World War II. Full details coming soon. I saw the post while scrolling on my phone during a lunch break. My heart rate doubled. This was it. This was real. This was happening. I didn't expect anyone I knew to see it. The post was on a specialized auction house account. Photography collectors, museum curators, people who spent their days thinking about camera history, not delivery drivers and their suburban families who thought cameras were just the things built into iPhones. But I underestimated social media algorithms. Kyle saw it. Of course Kyle saw it. Some photography account he followed must have shared it. Or maybe Instagram's algorithm served it to him because he'd been at that yard sale, because his phone's location data knew he'd been there, because the digital universe is creepy like that. He sent me a screenshot, 3 texts in rapid succession. The first was just question marks. The second was the Instagram post. The third said we needed to talk immediately. I didn't respond. Turned off my phone and finished my delivery route. But I knew what was coming. I'd known from the moment I realized what that camera was worth, that eventually they'd find out. Eventually there would be consequences. I just didn't expect it to happen so fast. The lawsuit papers arrived 6 days after the Instagram post, hand-delivered by a process server who found me loading packages into my van. Professional summons, legal jargon, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. My mother and brother as plaintiffs, me as defendant. They were suing to void the sale, claiming mutual mistake of fact, arguing that neither party knew the true value at the time of transaction, and therefore the sale was invalid. They also threw in fraudulent concealment, suggested I'd known what the camera was worth all along, and deliberately deceived them. Reading those papers felt like getting punched in the stomach. They were accusing me of being a con artist, of manipulating grieving family members, of stealing what rightfully belonged to all of us. Never mind that they'd been the ones selling Grandpa's stuff like it was garage sale trash. Never mind that they'd set the price. Never mind that they'd made a joke out of the whole transaction. The worst part was the temporary restraining order. The court had frozen everything. The camera couldn't leave the country. The auction was blocked. It was sitting in a Brink security vault in Philadelphia, legally impounded, until this got resolved. Everything I'd discovered, everything I'd hoped for, just stuck, frozen, possibly about to be taken away. I sat in my van reading those papers over and over. Cars honked at me to move. People walked past. The world kept spinning. But I felt like I was drowning. I couldn't afford a lawyer. Real lawyers cost money I didn't have. The kind of money you need when you're fighting people who live in houses with country club memberships and BMWs on lease. The kind of money I wouldn't have until I won this case, which I couldn't win without money for a lawyer. The catch-22 was almost funny. Almost. I called legal aid. Got transferred 4 times. Finally reached someone who listened to my story and gave me a name. Marcus Jones. Young attorney taking cases on contingency, meaning he only got paid if we won, meaning he'd work for free if he thought the case was strong enough. Marcus's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation place. Not exactly prestigious. But when I walked in and saw him behind that desk, saw the way he looked at the papers I brought, the way his eyes lit up when he read that Venmo transaction description, I knew I'd found the right person. He was maybe 30. Black guy with close-cropped hair, and a suit that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed. He read through everything methodically, didn't say much, just nodded occasionally and made notes. Then he looked up at me and asked me one question. Had I known what the camera was worth when I bought it? I told him the truth. No, I thought it was junk, broken equipment. I'd bought it for the photographs inside, for the memories of Grandpa. I didn't discover what it was until days later when my cat knocked it off a shelf, and I started researching the serial number. Marcus leaned back in his chair, started smiling. He said this was the easiest case he'd seen in months. He explained how it worked. He'd take 35% of whatever we won. If we lost, I paid him nothing. But we weren't going to lose, because my brother had made a critical mistake when he thought he was being clever, when he'd written that joke in the Venmo transaction. Final sale, no returns. Those words were legally binding. They constituted a waiver of claims, a statement that the seller had no intention of accepting returns or challenging the sale regardless of circumstances. Combined with the description of the item as scrap metal, it proved they'd made their own valuation. They'd decided it was worthless. They'd sold it as worthless. What I did with it afterward was none of their business. Marcus said their lawyer would argue mutual mistake, would claim this was an extraordinary circumstance, would probably bring up fairness and family obligations and emotional appeals. But contract law didn't care about feelings. It cared about agreements. And we had the agreement in writing, time-stamped, documented, with my brother's own words sealing the deal. He asked me one more thing. Could I live with it? If we won, if I kept all the money and they got nothing, if I permanently severed ties with my mother and brother over this, because that's what would happen, win or lose, the family would never be the same. I looked at Marcus, thought about my mother watching that estate liquidator walk through Grandpa's house, thought about Kyle laughing while he typed that Venmo note, thought about them selling memories for money while I'd been trying to save them. I told him I could live with it just fine. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Civil court in Philadelphia. Judge Patricia Morrison presiding. A woman in her 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings and zero patience for time wasting. My mother's lawyer was exactly what you'd expect. Expensive suit, graying hair perfectly styled, a voice that sounded like he did closing arguments in his sleep. He painted a picture of a family tragedy. A grandson who'd taken advantage of grief, who deceived his own mother and brother for personal gain. He made me sound like a monster. Then Marcus stood up. He didn't have the expensive suit or the practiced voice, but he had something better. He had the truth, and he had receipts. He called me to testify. I stood up there in the cheap button-down shirt I'd bought at Target the night before and told my story. Told them about Grandpa, about the darkroom, about the promise, about watching them sell his life piece by piece like it meant nothing. Told them I'd gone to that yard sale to say what I could, that I'd asked for the box of photographs, that Kyle had demanded money for it, that I'd paid every cent I had left. Then Marcus pulled out his phone, connected it to the courtroom display, brought up the Venmo transaction on the big screen for everyone to see. The timestamp, the amount, $100. And underneath, in Kyle's own words, scrap metal box, final sale, no returns. Judge Morrison leaned forward, asked the bailiff to zoom in on that text. She read it out loud, slowly, each word hanging in the air like an accusation. Scrap, metal, box, final, sale, no, returns. She looked at Kyle over her glasses, asked him if he'd written that, if those were his words, his intent. Kyle's face went red. He started stammering, saying it was a joke, that he hadn't meant it literally, that he'd been making fun of the situation, that obviously he would have acted differently if he'd known what was actually in the box. The judge's expression didn't change. She asked him if he understood what the word final meant, what no returns meant, whether he'd meant those words at the time, or whether he was the kind of person who didn't mean what they wrote in legally binding financial transactions. Kyle didn't have a good answer for that. Their lawyer tried to recover, argued that this was an extraordinary circumstance, that the disparity in value was so extreme that basic fairness demanded reconsideration, that contract law had provisions for when both parties made fundamental mistakes about the nature of what was being exchanged. Marcus countered beautifully, pointed out that only one party had made a mistake. The seller had valued the item, had set the price, had described it explicitly as scrap metal. The buyer had accepted those terms, had paid the asking price, had taken possession of the property. What the buyer did afterward with their legally purchased property was irrelevant. They could have thrown it in a dumpster, could have used it as a doorstop, could have spent years researching it and discovering its value. None of that changed the original transaction. He cited case law, Pennsylvania contract precedents, the principle of caveat venditor. Let the seller beware. When you sell something, you bear the risk of having undervalued it. Judge Morrison nodded along, made notes, asked a few clarifying questions. Then she made her ruling. Right there, no recess to deliberate, no taking it under advisement. She said the evidence was clear. The seller had described the item as scrap metal, had set a price accordingly, had included explicit language about the finality of the sale, had accepted payment on those terms. The buyer had done nothing fraudulent, had concealed nothing, had simply purchased what was offered at the price that was asked. The fact that the item turned out to be valuable was the seller's mistake, and in contract law, that mistake was binding. The doctrine of caveat venditor applied. Let the seller beware. They should have been more careful about what they were selling. Motion denied. Restraining order lifted. The camera would be released to the defendant immediately. The sound of her gavel hitting the bench was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. One sharp crack. Final. No appeal. Done. Kyle looked like he'd been slapped. My mother was crying. Real tears this time. Not the manipulative kind from her phone calls. Actual tears of someone realizing they just lost millions of dollars to their own arrogance and carelessness. I didn't feel triumphant. Didn't feel vengeful. Just felt tired. Like I'd been carrying something heavy and finally got to set it down. Marcus shook my hand. Told me the auction could proceed. The camera would sell. I'd get my money. He'd get his cut. Justice had been served. Outside the courtroom, on the steps of the municipal building, my mother caught up with me. She grabbed my arm. Her makeup was running. She looked older than I'd ever seen her look. She said my name, said she was my mother, said she'd made a mistake, that we were family, that we could start over, fix this, that she knew I was a good person, that Grandpa had loved me, that surely I wouldn't let this destroy our relationship over money. I looked at her, this woman who'd given birth to me, who'd raised me, who'd taught me that everything had a price and nothing had value. I told her she'd sold Grandpa's memory for $100, that I bought it for $100, that it was a fair business transaction, just like Kyle had said. Final sale, no returns. Then I pulled my arm free and walked down those courthouse steps. Didn't run, didn't look back, just walked. She called after me. shouted my name. Leo, Leo. Like if she said it loud enough, I'd turn around and become the son she wanted instead of the grandson Grandpa had raised. I kept walking. That night, I changed my phone number, blocked them on social media, cut every connection. Some people might call that cold, unforgiving, unchristian or un-American, or whatever moral framework they want to apply. But I'd learned something from Grandpa that they never understood. Sometimes the most valuable thing you own is your ability to walk away from people who don't deserve you. The auction happened 3 weeks later. Vienna, the fancy kind with online streaming and paddle numbers and people calling in from around the world. I watched it from Marcus's office, on his laptop. Couldn't bring myself to watch alone. The bidding started at 5 million. Climbed fast. Every increment felt surreal. 8 million, 10 million, 12 million. Numbers that didn't connect to reality anymore. Just abstract concept of wealth. Final hammer price was 14 million, $400,000. After the auction house took their commission, after Marcus took his contingency fee, after taxes were projected and set aside, I walked away with just over $8 million clear. $8 million. I kept working for 2 weeks after the money hit my account, drove my delivery route, dropped off medical supplies, acted like nothing had changed. I think I needed to prove to myself it was real, that I could stop any time I wanted, that this wasn't a dream I'd wake up from. Then I gave notice, paid off my student loans, which weren't much but had been hanging over me since I dropped out of community college, paid off medical debt from when I'd broken my arm and didn't have insurance. All those little financial anchors that had been slowly drowning me. Didn't buy a house, didn't buy a car, didn't do anything stupid. Just sat with it for a while and thought about what Grandpa would have wanted. 6 months after the auction, I opened Arthur's Gallery on a corner lot in Northern Liberties. Not the fancy part of Philadelphia, not the tourist area, but a neighborhood that was real, where artists actually lived, where people cared about things beyond price tags. It wasn't a general photography gallery. It was specialized war photography, conflict documentation, photojournalism from places most people try to forget, the kind of work Grandpa had done, the kind of work that showed the world what it didn't want to see. Opening night was small, intentionally small. Some local photographers, a few journalists, people who understood what the space meant. The centerpiece of the main room wasn't fancy. 3 photographs in simple wooden frames. Grandpa's Vietnam work. The images I'd saved from that cardboard box. A soldier in a foxhole. A medic working on a wounded man. A child's face in front of a destroyed building. Under them, a brass plaque. Arthur Bennett, 1925 to 2023. U.S. Army Signal Corps, Vietnam 1967 to 1969. And his words, the ones he told me in that darkroom when I was 12. A camera is just a box. Your heart does the shooting. I wore my new camera that night. A Leica M11. The modern descendant of the prototype that had changed my life. It felt right somehow. Full circle. Grandpa's broken promise had led me to a fortune, and that fortune had led me back to what he'd actually tried to teach me all along. Not that cameras mattered. Not that equipment made the photographer. But that seeing mattered, that bearing witness mattered, that capturing truth mattered more than anything else. Someone at the opening asked me about the story, about how I'd funded the gallery. I told them about Grandpa, about the promise, about the box of scrap metal that turned out to be history. I didn't tell them about my mother or Kyle. That wasn't their story. That was mine, and I'd already closed that chapter. The gallery does okay. Not making me rich, but I'm already rich. It supports itself, gives local photojournalists a place to show work that newspapers won't publish anymore. Work that matters. Work that challenges. Work that makes people uncomfortable in the necessary ways. Sometimes I stand in front of Grandpa's photographs and remember that day in his darkroom. Remember his hands showing me how to see light. Remember his promise that everything would be mine someday. He was right. Just not in the way either of us expected. I didn't inherit his cameras. I inherited his vision, his understanding that value and price are different things. that the world tries to reduce everything to dollars, but some things matter more than money. A camera is just a box. Equipment is just equipment. But how you see, what you choose to show, that's everything. Grandpa taught me to see value where others saw trash, to find meaning where others found junk, to understand that the most important things are often the things everyone else walks past without noticing. I looked at that ugly, broken, beaten camera and saw a possibility. My family looked at it and saw $50 of scrap metal. The difference between those two perspectives, that was worth $14 million. But more than that, it was worth knowing that I'd honor what he tried to teach me, that I'd learned the lesson, that I'd become the person he'd hoped I'd be. The gallery is quiet tonight. Soft lights on the photographs. Shadows in the corners. Outside, the city keeps moving. People rushing to somewhere, chasing something. Try and find value in a world that confuses price with worth. But in here, in this space built with a fortune found in a box of trash, the distinction is clear. I learned to see. Everything else followed from that. Fade to black.